For a while, this Barcelona project has been showing promising signs, but what has been missing is a big win in a game of any real significance. They failed in the Champions League, they failed in the last El Clásico, but finally, with this 3-1 win against Real Madrid, those demons have been put to bed. So while the headlines will be about Xavi's first trophy, I want to take a closer look at the performance, because frankly, it was a game that Barcelona absolutely dominated, and for me, represents a real turning point in this project. So why is that, and how did they suddenly look like prime, well, Barcelona? Let's find out. So as always, before we get into the in-depth analysis, a big shout out to our video sponsor OneFootball for continuing to support what we do here. With the OneFootball app, you'll always have the latest football news in your pocket, with live scores, fixtures, stats, and even game highlights from the teams that you care about the most. It's also a great source of transfer news, and since there's still plenty of time left in the January transfer window, and since I'm absolutely useless at keeping up to date with all the goings on, the OneFootball app is a lifesaver for me. Just today actually, I learned about some fresh transfer rumours for Barcelona, which I didn't expect, particularly in this window. So to stay up to date with all of that, make sure you download the OneFootball app using the first link in the description, or by scanning the QR code on screen. It is completely free. So in the last Clásico, Real Madrid set up in a 4-4-2 out of possession, but that usually became a 5 at the back as Valverde dropped into the back line. And it was exactly the same here, becoming a 5-4-1 or 5-3-2 depending on whether Vinicius felt like defending or not. Either way, they're pretty deep, looking to contain Barcelona primarily, and then finding something in transition, which is pretty much exactly how that last Clásico went. Meanwhile, Barcelona created a system pretty specifically for this game. Although on paper it looked very much like the 3-4-3 used against Atletico Madrid, which I covered in my last video. It was obviously the same personnel, but the shape was more of a lopsided 4-3-3, with Balde pushing up, Xavi tucking inside from a left wing position, and Frenkie de Jong covering behind them. But honestly, the main thing you need to know about this system was its fluidity, particularly on that left-hand side. Whether that was Xavi dropping deep and Frenkie de Jong then pushing up, or Balde staying deep and Xavi remaining wide left, or even Lewandowski coming across to create an overload. And between these rotations and the sheer number of players that Barca had on that left side, where Valverde was dropping into the back line, Real Madrid really struggled to deal with it. Busquets also being there constantly forced Kroos to press up, and Gavi's movement deep forced Carvajal out of the back line, and time and again Real failed to follow the rotation and ended up leaving someone free. In this instance it's Frenkie de Jong, who can then play a third man pass into Pedri. And the same thing happened for the second goal, with Frenkie unmarked between the lines, who then finds Gavi's run. From a Barcelona perspective, it was this level of fluidity and dynamism, as well as of course the technical quality of these players, that was so effective and so good to watch. Rather than just executing practice patterns, it feels like they're taking more individual responsibility to seek and exploit space. So here's an example. Lewandowski drops deep to draw in a centre-back, Xavi runs into the space vacated, and Pedri, who's wandered over from the right, finds him with the pass. If you haven't realised by now, movement is absolutely everything in this system, so it was actually quite encouraging to see, within seconds, 3 players making runs in behind. First Pedri, then Balde, and then Xavi, all within 10 seconds. And every time this happens, space is created that someone else might be able to exploit. That is really the whole purpose of this positional play system from Xavi. For Madrid, this is all really hard to deal with, but they didn't necessarily help themselves. Vinicius's lack of defensive duty allowed Pedri to find pockets a little bit too easily, and in general, with Benzema and Vinicius not applying very much pressure, Real were a little bit too passive, meaning Barca's backline were comfortable in possession, and Madrid didn't really start applying any pressure until they were already 2-0 down. No slight on Vinicius though, really. I know that it isn't really his role, and also offensively, he was one of Real Madrid's most potent, if their only potent player. Regardless, after 2-0, it became quite similar to the previous Clásico, but the roles were reversed, as Barca sacrificed threat ahead of the ball in order to keep control. You might remember that's what Real Madrid did last time if you watched my analysis of that game, and that's when all the olays and the backheel passes started to come out. Funnily enough though, none of this was really the chief reason for the result. By that I mean Barca's possession and passing moves. And you probably won't believe this, but it was Barca's defensive performance that was really the most unexpected and devastating thing about this game and about Xavi's tactics. So let's talk about them. This defensive setup from Barca was a clear example of Xavi Hernandez learning and adapting as a manager. Last Clásico, Real quite easily bypassed Barca's press by becoming very wide and, like we said, sacrificing players ahead of the ball to create overloads in the first phase and on the flanks as well. And so for one of the first times ever, I think, Xavi actually departed from his usual pressing strategy. If you watch this channel a lot, you'll know that they're usually man-to-man all over the opposition build-up. They'll then press the goalkeeper too and try and force long balls. That has actually become an issue in some games, and Xavi changed it here. There was definitely still a press, but Xavi chose to allow the Real Madrid centre-backs the ball. That's quite rare. The midfielders were then man-marked, so Pedri on Kroos, Frenkie and Busquets on Modric and Camavinga, and Barca's wide players covering the fullbacks. The press then happened in two stages. The first was through Lewandowski angling his run to force Real towards their left-hand side. Dembele's job is to block the passing lane into Vinicius, while showing Madrid further down the line. At this point, Barca have a pretty good position. Araujo can step up to squeeze Vinicius, everybody's man-marked, and you'll notice that Pedri closes in to create a numerical advantage. That leaves Kroos free, who drops back to escape the pressure, but what happens next was actually the beauty of this system, because when Kroos is found and uses Modric to play their way out into the fullback, Barca don't commit to a second aggressive press and try and stop them. They could have Balde pushing up here and deny Carvajal the time on the ball, but instead they shift across the pitch as a unit, ending up in this loose 4-4-2 shape. I say loose because De Jong's responsibility is to pressure Modric rather than cover the space, and it was this setup, a press on one side and then falling into a very compact mid-block on the other, that was really the tactical masterstroke from Xavi. I mean, 2 of the 3 goals came directly from the press. In the first, Busquets intercepts in the first phase to set up goal number 1, and Xavi in the second phase intercepts the crossfield ball, breaking out of that mid-block to set up the 3rd goal. And while it's a little more conservative than usual, this is still a pretty brave setup from Barcelona, considering how high that back line is. In fact, it's incredibly compact. You can see how many players are around the ball, and that obviously leaves space elsewhere. But against a Real Madrid team who were pretty reluctant to go over the top and who do tend to drop a lot of players deep for the sake of build-up and possession, Barca's compactness was a huge advantage. I lost count of how many times Real Madrid escaped the first wave of pressure. Well, by escapes, I suppose I mean they left the pressure by going sideways rather than forward, only then to get outnumbered on the flanks where they couldn't progress the ball. And this strategy of creating numerical superiority, even if it meant giving up space elsewhere, was the key to Barca's controlling of this game. And that goes for their on-the-ball work and their off-the-ball work. It was really all about numerical superiority. Defensively, this took a huge physical effort to accomplish, constantly shifting across the width of the pitch, pressing up and then falling back quickly enough to deny Real the space. But in combination with the shape and the movement in possession, this performance became utterly dominant from Barca. To be fair, in the second half, like I said, after 2-0, they were a lot more controlling on the ball, so they gave up a lot of potential threat for the sake of possession. The defensive line also dropped pretty deep, and they ended up seeing out the game rather than continuing to generate threat or continuing with the extremely high line, but this made perfect sense considering Real's lack of penetration, really. So huge credit to Xavi for adapting and creating this strategy. Obviously, he looked a lot at that last game against Real Madrid and changed the things that weren't working. From a Real Madrid perspective, it was a very strange performance. Defensively, it still feels like they're too passive in these big games. They give their opposition a chance to play, and that's really coming back to hurt them when they're playing against quality teams that can exploit even a deep defensive shape. They also did very little to address the numerical disadvantages on the ball. They were often in those 2 versus 3 or 4 or 8 situations, so a lot to think about from a Real Madrid perspective. For Barca though, I give huge credit particularly to the midfield. Busquets was rolling back the years. Frenkie de Jong produced a performance that I think Barca fans have been waiting to see for a long time now. Although, given the circumstances, and given this system in particular, it made sense that he began to flourish. I could really credit all the midfielders, to be fair. Xavi was obviously incredible, adding goals to his game alongside Pedri. The composition and balance of this midfield is actually something that I want to talk about a lot more, but to be able to do that subject to justice, I'm going to make a second video later this week talking specifically about this Barcelona midfield, why it is now flourishing, and how to plan around it for the future. So look forward to that. But all in all, this was a huge result for Barcelona. A first trophy under Xavi, a Clásico victory in a final. This really is a vindicating performance for the project and will hopefully take some of the media pressure off. I also hope it's a turning point for the players to convince them they're heading in the right direction, but also that they're good enough to compete at this level. They can dominate teams, they can dominate elite teams, and they can do so playing this way. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this game and I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do leave a like if you did, and subscribe if you don't want to miss that second video. Like I said, hopefully it'll be coming out before the end of the week. And with that, I'll see you very soon. Take care.